All right, so we're going to look at Book 9 of Paradise Lost, and with it the main subject matter insofar as it finally recounts the fall of mankind proper, which was announced in the very first line of the poem, a man's first disobedience. This is the first disobedience, and as I say, it is, although it is announced in Book 1, it is not actually recounted until Book 9. And we get the fourth and final invocation of a muse as a part of the introduction to the books. If you want to see it in that term for sure, you could also call it a prologue. And it is not a direct address. It reflects a certain distance, and it creates a certain structural pattern there in the books. So broadly considered, as I've said already, books 1 to 6 deal with the fall of the angels and its consequences. Books 7 to 12 deal with creation and the fall of mankind. So it's two parts. Again, when you looked at the structure of Virgil's Aeneid, it's also containing two parts. One is the account of Aeneas the Trojan, and the second part, Book 7 and onwards, are Aeneas the Roman. So he descends into the underworld in the Aeneid as a Trojan. He comes up out of the underworld as a Roman, very much bolstered by the vision that he sees of the future and what he will do there. But also within the context of that book, the Aeneid, the wanderings of Aeneas are the subject matter of books 1 to 6. In that sense, very much making the Aeneid like the Odyssey, whereas books 7 to 12 of the Aeneid are dealing with the battles that will ensue when he lands in Latium in Italy and has to take the territory there that will eventually become the foothold for the Roman Empire. It's for the city that will be built, that will after which the Roman people will be named. In Milton's account, he obviously shifts that structuring. It's not about wanderings and about wars. It's more about the fall of the angels and then the fall of mankind. And note, however, we've already said that there is an explicit comparison made there between the fall of Satan and his fellow rebel angels, recounted in the War of Heaven of books 5 and 6, and the fall of mankind. And God himself, the Father, comments on this, saying that the first were self-depraved and not tempted, and therefore they will receive no grace, whereas the other, being tempted by the angels, the fallen angels, chiefly Satan, will obtain grace. So there are parallels here clearly being set up by Mr. Milton, and yet within those also significant contrasts. So the angels are sort of foils, and we've seen that Milton's Satan reflects on the different treatment between himself and mankind, and much envies it. And that's a way of Milton amplifying the grace and favor of God for mankind. Even though man is born of terrestrial mold, he nonetheless receives a more favorable outcome than the angelic powers that fell. But we left off last time in Book 8, it lost somewhat in cosmology, and it leaves off with the angel ascending back up to heaven and Adam going back to his bower. Those are the concluding words of Book 8. And now Milton, the narrator, the epic poet, intercedes, makes himself conspicuous in the narrative for the fourth time, and provides a transition point in discussing this. And we could read through the argument here, but I'm not going to waste time on that here, because it's going to take all of my time to get through Book 9. And even then I'm going to come up short. But let me begin with reading this prologue, or this invocation of the muse, for the fourth time. Milton makes the transition by saying this: "No more of talk where God or angel guest, with man, as with his friend, familiar used to sit indulgent, and with him partake rural repast, permitting him the while venial discourse unblamed. I now must change those notes to tragic. Foul distrust and breach disloyal on the part of man, revolt and disobedience on the part of heaven, now alienated, distance and distaste, anger and just rebuke, and judgment given, that brought into this world a world of woe, sin and her shadow death, and misery death's harbinger. Sad task, yet argument not less but more heroic than the wrath of stern Achilles on his foe, pursued thrice fugitive about Troy wall, or rage of Turnus for Lavinia disespoused, or Neptune's ire, or Juno's that so long perplexed the Greek in Cytherea's son. If answerable style I can obtain of my celestial patroness, who deigns her nightly visitation unimplored, and dictates to me slumbering, or inspires easy my unpremeditated verse, since first the subject for heroic song please me long choosing, and beginning late, not sedulous by nature to indite wars, hitherto the only argument heroic deemed, chief mastery to dissect with long and tedious havoc, fabled knights and battles feigned, the better fortitude of patience and heroic martyrdom unsung, or to describe races and games, or tilting furniture, emblazoned shields and presses, quaint caparisons and steeds, bases and tinsel trappings, gorgeous knights at joust and tournament, then marshalled feast served up in hall with sewers and seneschals, the skill of artifice or office mean, not that which justly gives heroic name to person or to poem. Me, of these nor skilled nor studious, higher argument remains, sufficient of itself to raise that name, unless an age too late, or cold climate, or years damp, my intended wing depressed, and much they may, if all be mine, not hers who brings it nightly to mine ear. So it is more of a prologue than an invocation of a muse, although he mentions the celestial patroness. He doesn't actually invoke the patroness, although he suggests that but he brings to mind the fact that this tale is not his own, and thereby introduces the idea that this is a divinely inspired text, and really presents the ceremonial occasions here. Now, the references that he makes here to epics past are obviously the Greek and Roman epics of Homer and Virgil, already mentioned, but he's also referring here to Boiardo and Ariosto, and Tasso and Spenser, who has described the sorts of, in heroic form, that of jousting and of knights, or of the taking of Jerusalem from Islam, from the Muslims. Jerusalem liberate, or Sidney's Arcadia, having the descriptions of knights and so forth. So he has immediate forebears in mind that were Christian and not simply his pagan secular forebears. And he could have followed their template in describing again notions of Christian chivalry and the Christian armed and the church militant. And if he had done so, he would have followed in the illustrious paths of his forebears. But he is not going to write in such worldly terms. He doesn't see the battle in that form. And it's interesting, given the fact that Milton has himself been involved in political office for a government that was involved in political warfare against its physical enemy, so Charles I, and had established a republican government, that he now, to some degree, perhaps chastened by that, regards those sorts of physical manifestations of a spiritual battle to be less significant than the actual physical conflict which he is now going to be describing within each person. And one of the questions that must be raised here, and I'm not sure I can give an adequate answer to it, is Milton retreating from any sense of public Christianity and initiating a sort of pietism within the believer? The believer in God, what matters most is the relationship of the individual, his or her Christian profession, to God, and is retreating from an external engagement at all. That's not abundantly clear from the text. I don't think it's conclusive, but it moves in that direction, I will say, certainly. Just by choice of subject matter and by what he just says about his predecessors here. And he's chosen late. Remember, I said earlier on when talking about Milton and his sense that he was going to write the epic, was going to choose King Arthur as his subject matter. A certain ideal of Christian chivalry around knighthood and so forth, and has decided in the end not to use that as his subject matter, but rather this account, which is obviously more biblically related and less situated in a particular time and a place, and less English, if you will, more universal thereby. All these things are very interesting. And he mentions three factors that might prevent his success. Well, the belatedness and the general corruption of nature, the fate of this age. Adverse to epic writing. Maybe we don't live in an age where epics can any longer be written. We don't have the epic, the capacity to write epics any longer, or even a willingness of our culture to listen to epic diction. Secondly, he talks about the climate, something adverse in our climate, too far north. It's as bad as the heat, and to some degree, it prevents, it makes us more subject to a natural melancholy. People today would call it depression, seasonal affective disorder. The terminology used in our day. Milton would obviously know nothing of that, but he does observe the effect of the cold and the dark on the sensibilities, and he sees it as restrictive in some ways of the flourishing of human nature, just like the growth season in agriculture is reduced in the northern climes. Similarly, he seems to suggest that human cultures are also, to some degree, frostbitten, and they don't flourish to the same degree. And then finally, his old age. He's maybe not up to it, because not only is he 58 when he writes the 1667 version, but he's also lost his sight. So all these things are strikes against the writing of a grand epic, which he believed that he was called to write in early days. Is it not too late? And his answer to this is that yes, it is. It's too late. At least if all be mine. And there's the great if all be mine, and not hers who brings it nightly to my ear. But because there is no impediment to God's work, if it be God's. And he has claimed that throughout. And this is an rather extraordinary claim, although it's not different from that of the pagan muses and the pagan epic writers. They too believed that they were divinely inspired in this. And Milton reiterates it and has greater warrant for doing so, in the sense that Scripture, to which he appeals, also warrants the gift of the Holy Spirit working in God's people, and here in particular as a poet. So there's the beginning of it, and famous at that. And he also talks about the shift to a tragic mode. So he's been writing an epic, yes, but he is now going to shift his tones to tragic, because he's about to tell of the fall of mankind. And so within the book, the whole book of the epic, Book 9 is a sort of a mini book, because it tells a tragedy. And a tragedy requires a figure who is greater than us, whom we admire. And in this case, that figure is none other than mankind. They are our superiors. We need to see Adam and Eve, and he's already spent a considerable time with Adam and Eve, showing us how great they are. This is one of Lewis's points. We must not see Adam and Eve as noble savages, naive and yet unlearned, not capable of understanding things. He has been at pains to show the opposite. Adam is the greatest man who ever lived. When he fell, his successors were implicated in his fall and were not nearly as great as he. So there's a tragic hero for sure in Adam. Likewise, there's a hamartia, a sin. Aristotle describes this as one of the key features. There's a fatal error that he makes. He misses the mark. And then there's a reversal and so forth. There's features of the tragedy within Book 9 that are itself worthy of study, but let me not delay any longer on this because I want to get forward on this. But I will skip over Satan, who now is looking for a place and a context in which he can work his ill, and he chooses, line 86, the serpent. Remember last time he chose the guise of a toad and whispered in Eve's ear? Well, this time he chooses, well, quite obviously, because he follows the biblical text here, chooses the serpent. Why the serpent? Because he's the subtlest of all the field. Subtlest beast of all the field. Him, after long debate, irresolute of thoughts revolved, his final sentence chose fit vessel. Fittest imp of fraud, in whom to enter, and his dark suggestions hide from sharpest sight. For in the wily snake, whatever slights, none would suspicious mark, because the snake moves to and fro. He naturally oscillates back and forth. So the tendency to not be constant in his movement, to move around and herky-jerky, like Satan himself was and was spied by Uriel already once, will be now hidden from the archangel's sight. And thereby he will work. And of course, this will also aid him when he is speaking to Eve, because his the naturally toing and froing of the snake are like Satan's own arguments. Now, Milton is going to come to call them mazy, and as a consequence, Eve will be amazed as well. And a maze, if you've ever seen one of them, is a sort of a natural built out of hedges and so forth, and you go into the maze, and it's hard to find your way out. You get lost in the maze, and Eve will get lost in his arguments, not because of her incapacity to think, but because he will lead her astray purposefully, and in part because his arguments and his ways seem appropriate to his physical design. He says, which another beast observed, doubt might beget of diabolic power, active within beyond the sense of brute. But here it's entirely appropriate. So it's not the snake per se that's evil, it's that Satan being evil and being toing and froing and is full of subtlety. This would betray itself in other beasts that don't work that way. They're straightforward. A lion goes straight for the kill. Remember, later on in Scripture, Satan is referred to as a lion looking for somebody to devour. But that's not how he appears here. He appears as subtle and twisty. So now he pours his complaints. His plaints just before he does this. O earth, how like to heaven if not preferred more justly? Seats worthier of gods. We mustn't take Satan's, by the way, observations to be accurate here. It's not worthier. But seat worthier of gods as built with second thoughts, reforming what was old. For what God after better, worse would build? Terrestrial heaven, danced round by other heavens that shine, yet bear their bright officious lamps, light above light. For thee alone, it seems, in thee concentering all their precious beams of sacred influence. As God in heaven is center, yet extends to all, so thou, centering, receives from all those orbs. In thee, not in themselves, all their known virtue appears productive in herb, plant, and nobler birth of creatures animate with gradual life of growth, sense, reason, all summed up in man. With what delight could I have walked thee round, if I could joy in aught? Sweet interchange of hill and valley, river, woods, and plains. Now land, now sea, and shores with forest crowned rocks, dens, and caves. But I in none of these find place or refuge. And the more I see pleasures about me, so much more I feel torment within me. As from this hateful siege of contraries, all good to me becomes bane, and in heaven much worse would be my state. But neither here seek I, no, nor in heaven to dwell, unless by mastering heaven supreme, nor hope to be myself less miserable by what I seek, but others to make such as I, though thereby worse to me redound. For only in destroying I find ease to my relentless thoughts, and him destroyed, or one to what may work his utter loss, for whom all this was made. All this will soon follow, as to him linked in weal or woe. In woe then, that destruction wide may range. To me shall be the glory sole among the infernal powers, in one day to have marred what he almighty styled 6 nights and days continued making, and who knows how long before had been contriving, though perhaps not longer than since I in one night freed from servitude and glorious well nigh half the angelic name, and thinner left the throng of his adorers. He, to be avenged and to repair his numbers thus impaired, whether such virtue spent of old now failed, more angels to create, if they at least are his created, or to spite us more, determined to advance into our room a creature formed of earth, and him endow, exalted from so base original with heavenly spoils, our spoils. What he decreed, he effected. Man he made, and for him built magnificent this world, and earth his seat. Him Lord pronounced, and indignity subjected to his service angel wings, and flaming ministers to watch and tend their earthly charge. Of these the vigilance I dread, and to elude thus wrapped in mist of midnight vapor, glide obscure, and pry in every bush and brake, where hap may find the serpent sleeping, in whose mazy folds to hide me in the dark intent I bring. O foul descent, that I, who erst contended with gods to sit the highest, am now constrained into a beast, and mixed with bestial slime. This essence to incarnate and imbrute, that to the height of deity aspired. Note, just comment here, he finds it repugnant that he of spiritual nature should become incarnate. Obviously an implication by Milton on the incarnation. And remember, he's already said to be weak is miserable, doing or suffering. The very idea of incarnation, now we're dealing with terrestrial physical matter, this is repugnant as well. And again, impossible for him to imagine God's means of redemption. And again, even God's ways of favoring a creature so low as mankind by having angels serve him, he already finds this extraordinary. And that is because in one sense it is, of course. This is part of God's condescension, part of his character. But he says, But what will not ambition and revenge descend to? Who aspires must bend down as low as base he soared. Obnoxious first or last to basest things. Revenge, at first though sweet, bitter ere long back on itself recoils. Let it, I reck not, so it light well aimed. Since higher I fall short, on him who next provokes my envy, this new favored of heaven, this man of clay, son of despite, who must the more to spite his maker, raised from dust. Spite then with spite is best repaid. So you get something here of, again, evil be thou my good, and Milton's Satan depicting an Augustinian notion of evil. He can't do anything. His whole methodology is that of the privation of the good. He can't actually succeed. There's no good that he can attain because all good comes from God. He realizes there's no winning. All he is hoping for is to remove some good from the world, to remove it of its goodness, to bring mankind along with him. It's a wholly negative tactic. He doesn't promote a better good, a different good, because he realizes that's impossible, since all goods, including his own existence, comes directly from God. And in so doing, he even realizes that God, being God, will be able to work good out of evil. And he still can't help himself. And this is the great irony in the text, and it seems an irony. It doesn't seem particularly ironic when you look at the world around us and see all of the consequences of Satan's evil perversion of mankind and the what ensues, not just the crimes that we commit against each other, but the general maladies that come from the fall, storms and floods and inclement weather and poverty and disease, etc., that these are actually in some ways all under God's, not only his control, but all used to magnify the glory of what the Son does by becoming incarnate and dying the death that we deserved, bearing our sins. That a greater glory comes out of that. That's Milton's contention. But you need a theological vision to understand that, and Milton has that theological vision, and this is why I say the Romantics, when they read Milton's Satan as his hero, can only do so because they totally discard the theology and miss the whole point of the entire epic, and deprive it of its whole power, I would say, at that point as well. So we have great language, perhaps, which they emulate, but the actual substance, which really lends the epic diction its power, they have lost and can't emulate. But anyway, we left off with that, and it then, so saying, he goes and he goes and he goes into the serpent, and he enters through his mouth, and he then goes forward, looking forward, and then Milton shifts scenes, and the scene shifts to the human pair, Adam and Eve. And this is interesting because what we're going to have here, and again, this Milton is going to read into this now, into the biblical text in Genesis. He's going to separate Adam and Eve. And the text, as we read it here in Genesis, let's see if I can put this up here briefly. Should have put this up beforehand. Very brief. Woman saw that the tree was good for food, was pleasant to the eyes, the tree desirable to make one wise. She took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. Verse 6 has them together. Before this, however, verses 1 up to that point, the serpent is speaking, and he's speaking to Eve. He said to the woman in verse 1, has God said, as if Adam's not present. There are problems here in the text, and Milton's really filling in a lot of gaps. If it is only Eve that's present, what does it mean that Adam is with her when she eats? Does he agree with what she's done? Is he actually physically present when this transpires? If he is physically present, why is he standing there like a tree of ignorance while his wife is being tempted with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, when he directly has been told, you are to protect her from all ills in the garden, right? You're to tend and to keep. Why aren't you doing that? Why are you just standing there while she's listening to the serpent, and then she eats the fruit and then gives it to you, and you say, oh, okay. Lots of problems in the text. Milton reads into the text and he separates the two, which I think, again, the text is unclear about. Remember, we're not being given here a blow-by-blow record of what has happened in the sense of every incident being recounted for us. The bare myth is being presented, the substance, the kernel of the story. And the substance and the kernel of the story is that the disobedience happens. Now, later scriptures will say, I believe this is Peter who says that Adam was not deceived, but Eve was. And that adds something to help Milton come to the conclusion that Adam was not present. Because otherwise, if he wasn't fooled, why doesn't he intervene? Unless he wasn't fooled and yet he still did it. But if he wasn't fooled and he still did it, then why then is Eve why is that used as an apologetic for men in leadership in the preaching office of the church? So they won't do it because they're fooled, but they'll do it for reasons that don't even require them to be fooled. Right? So the more you look at it, the more complicated it gets in that sense. But suffice to say, Milton separates the two. How does he come to separate them? Well, that's what comes here in this passage. And it's through Eve's discourse with Adam. Remember, he's just been warned that there's a serpent in the garden, and watch out. And so Eve begins with this little conversation. Adam, well, maybe we labor still to dress this garden, still to tend, plant, herb, and flower are pleasant tasks and join, but till more hands aid us, the work under our labor grows. Luxurious by restraint. What we by day lop, overgrown, or prune, or prop, or bind, one night or two with wanton growth derides, tending to wild. Thou therefore now advise, or hear what to my mind first thoughts present. Let us divide our labors. Thou, where choice leads thee, or where most needs, whether to wind the woodbine round this arbor, or direct the clasping ivy where to climb, while I in yonder spring of roses intermixed with myrtle find what to redress till noon. So she proposes they divide their labors. And the reason that they do this is to be more efficient, be more productive. And productivity is obviously a good thing. That's what they're doing. God has commanded them to be fruitful and multiply. But to be fruitful, it not only refers to having offspring, but to actually their labor, because he tells them to work before the fall. Right? So she's commanding or suggesting something that will make them more productive. It's not a bad suggestion. It's not a fallen suggestion on her part. This is what she suggests. And she says one of the problems with this is that when we get too close to one another, we smile all the time and then have a discussion. And who knows what will happen after that? Well, we both know what will happen after that as well. And then we won't be working as much all the time. And so let's just separate for a while. To whom that mild answer Adam thus returned, soul, Eve, associate soul, to me beyond compare, above all living creatures dear. Well hast thou motioned, well thy thoughts employed, how we might best fulfill the work which here God hath assigned us. Nor of me shall pass unpraised, for nothing lovelier can be found in woman than to study household good. Remember that our word economics is the law of the household. The oikos, oikonomos. The oikos is the house. Economics is the law of the household. She is the master of the house in a sense. And proposing to do home economics in this sense is an entirely correct thing, that she should propose this. And it's good for her to propose it, and it's good that he praise her for it, because this is the means by which they shall together flourish. and good works in her husband to promote. So he's going to be more the external face of this, and she is going to be looking after the bottom line in the house, making sure that they're very productive labor. So he praises for this, and he then comments once again on solitude and society. Remember back last time I looked at, he commented briefly on that subject. The subject of solitude and society. And here he returns to the subject. So you might want to go back and look at that passage in books, I think it's book 7 at the end of that, where he talks about solitude and society and the nature thereof and the goods therein. And he said, we could do this, for solitude sometimes is best society, he notes, 249. And short retirement urges sweet return. But other doubt possesses me, lest harm befall thee severed from me, for thou knowest what hath been warned us, what malicious foe envying our happiness, and of his own despairing seeks to work us woe and shame by sly assault. So he's afraid because he's been warned that he has good reason to fear. And her response to this is to be hurt. To whom the Virgin Majesty of Eve, as one who loves and some unkindness meets, with sweet austere composure thus replied, unkindness, now they are humankind. They're sufficient, we've already heard from God that they're sufficient to have stood though free to fall. The phrase unkindness isn't that Adam's language is unkind or his tone is unkind. It's not the way he has spoken to her that she finds unkind. It's the inference that she can't withstand the temptations of the devil. And it suggests there's something lacking in her. That's how she takes what he is suggesting. And this will be the wedge that she will then use to argue her case that they ought to separate, or ought not to worry about separating is more the case. Not that they ought to separate. They ought to separate. He's already acknowledged that it's a good idea in the sense of productivity. But she's upset and responds to him, offspring of heaven and earth, and all earth's Lord, that such an enemy we have who seeks our ruin, both by thee informed I learn, and from the parting angel overheard. As in a shady nook I stood behind, just then returned at shut of evening flowers. But that thou shouldst my firmness therefore doubt, to God or thee, because we have a foe, may tempt it, I expected not to hear. His violence thou fearest not, being such as we, not capable of death or pain, can either not receive or can repel. His fraud is then thy fear, which plain infers thy equal fear, that my firm faith and love can by his fraud be shaken or seduced. Thoughts which how found they harbor in thy breast, Adam, misthought of her to thee so dear. She's hurt because he doubts her ability to withstand the fraudulent temptations of the devil. Now he's on the back foot. Note that so here's Milton's challenge. It's the challenge in reading in the text, which we have in reading Genesis 1 to 7 anyway, which is how do we account with such a short text as well for an extraordinary fall of a perfect human pair by just a few careful words from the devil. Well, Milton's going to help us by expanding greatly on the conversation that ensues. But when I say help us, he's going to fill in, and by helping us, he may actually impede us as well. This is his problem. This is why he needs celestial help, because really the celestial help is already given here in the biblical text. It just begs more questions. How is this possible? Boy, it seemed easy for Satan to bring them down. And here he introduces the idea that between the two of them, there is a little bit of hurt there. Now, the hurt is not yet sinful, so he can't overdo it and suggest that her response is inappropriate. It's appropriate, her response. Again, he has to depict Adam and Eve as unfallen. There is no sin in their thoughts and their words, their deeds, none of that. It's entirely within the scope of their actions to disagree and take different opinions on something. That's what's being showed here. There's a latitude of freedom that allows them to come to opposite conclusions. And we're going to find that she prevails in this, by the way, which again infers something about the nature of Eve, which feminist scholars tend to have, I think, diminished. The fact that Adam, who is unfallen, sees the superior argumentation of Eve and gives her his blessing, suggests that she has, I would say, a great deal of praise from Mr. Milton. At any rate, Adam, having heard this, uses healing words. And with healing words, because there's a little bit of a wound. Daughter of God and man, immortal Eve. Remember, Eve means life. For such thou art, from sin and blame entire. Not diffident of thee do I dissuade thy absence from my sight, but to avoid the attempt itself, intended by our foe. For he who tempts, though in vain, at least asperses the tempted with dishonor foul. Suppose not incorruptible of faith, not proof against temptation. Thou thyself with scorn and anger wouldst resent the offered wrong. Though ineffectual found, misdeem not then if such affront I labor to avert. It's not because I think less of you, it's because I love you and want to avoid that whole unpleasant scenario. It's because I esteem you and would not have you suffer that indignity. If such affront I labor to avert from thee alone, which on us both at once the enemy, though bold, will hardly dare, or daring first on me the assault shall light. For thou his malice and false guile condemn, nor thou his malice and false guile condemn. Subtle he needs must be who could seduce angels, nor think superfluous others' aid. I from the influence of thy looks receive access in every virtue. In thy sight more wise, more watchful, stronger, if need were of outward strength. While shame, thou looking on, shame to be overcome or overreached, would utmost vigor raise, and raised unite. Why shouldst not thou, like sense within thee feel when I am present, and thy trial choose with me, best witness of thy virtue tried? So he gives a very powerful argument for staying together, which is that he is stronger when she is present, and therefore she is stronger when he is present. And there's a witness to it then as well, and they both gather strength from this. He's created us in his image. We have the ability to stand, yes, but we're stronger together. He gets access from every virtue just by her very presence. She likewise from his virtue. Why on earth would they separate themselves? This seems like a good argument to me. So spake domestic Adam in his care, and matrimonial love, but Eve, who thought less attributed to her faith sincere, thus her reply with accent sweet, renewed. If this be our condition. Now, again, note this here. The address is a little less polite, just a little bit. No more offspring of heaven and earth and so forth. It's just if this. So that the speeches get more brief, a little bit more heated, a little bit more upset. And Milton is really replicating what we have in our own conversations when we fall out with people. They get a little bit shorter and a little bit sharper. And it's not like this is particularly short or sharp, but comparatively so. If this be our condition, thus to dwell in narrow circuit, straitened by a foe, subtle or violent, we not endued, single, with like defense, wherever met, how are we happy? Still in fear of harm. Remember, and here's the argument that Eve is going to use is the one that God himself uses in defense of the evil that will be charged of him. We are free. We've been created in Eden, and we've been made sufficient to have stood. We have freedom. We have enough in us to stand. She's going to use God's own argument against Adam. How are we happy still in fear of harm if we have to stick together to be safe? But harm precedes not sin. Only our foe, tempting, affronts us with his foul esteem of our integrity. His foul esteem sticks no dishonor on our front, but turns foul on himself. Then wherefore shunned or feared by us, who rather double honor gain from his surmise proved false, find peace within, favor from heaven, our witness from the event. And what is faith, love, virtue, unassayed alone, without exterior help sustained? That's God's own argument. I create them free because I created all beings free, because he wants to experience their genuine love. And they only will be able to exhibit their genuine love if they are capable to fall. They could choose something other than that. She's using the same argument. Let us not then suspect our happy state left so imperfect by the Maker wise as not secure to single or combine. Frail is our happiness, if this be so, and Eden were no Eden thus exposed. Now he's done. When I say he, Adam is done here. He can't fight against the logic that God himself used for creating mankind free, and each of them bearing his image, each separately and together. So note, she out-argues him. To whom thus Adam fervently replied. Why fervently? Because he realized that he's done. And he's upset about it. But he's not upset in the sense that his passions have overcome his reason. It makes perfect sense what you've said. But but now you're going to be exposed as a consequence of this. And how does he reply? Oh, woman. Sounds a little pejorative. That's because in the fallen world, when a man says, oh, woman, it's usually a little bit pejorative. I think that's reading into it here. But probably intentional on Milton's part to show Adam a little bit, again, distraught. Oh, woman. But she is woman. He's man, she's woman. Oh, woman, best are all things as the will of God ordained them. His creating hand nothing imperfect or deficient left. Of all that he created, much less man, or aught that might his happy state secure from outward force. Within himself the danger lies, yet lies within his power. Against his will he can receive no harm. But God left free the will, for what obeys reason is free. And reason he made right. By the way, the animals do not have reason. They're not free. They're subject to necessity. They have to follow their nature. Adam's nature, like Eve's, like the angels, like God's, is a rational nature. Freedom is a part of that nature, part of human nature. That's why we value freedom in our own lives, in politics, in relation to other people. We want some freedom. Very important, and all human beings prize this. But it is connected to reasoning. This is why reason to be a rational. To have a rational nature is part of being an individual, part of being a person. But God left free the will, for what obeys reason is free, and reason he made right, but bid her well beware and still erect, that is, on its guard, lest by some fair appearing good, surprised, she dictate false, and misinform the will, to do what God expressly hath forbid. Not then mistrust, but tender love enjoins, that I should mind thee oft, and mind thou me. Firm we subsist, yet possibly to swerve, since reason not impossibly may meet some specious object by the foe suborned, and fall into deception unaware, not keeping strictest watch, as she was warned. Seek not temptation then, which to avoid were better, and most likely, if from me thou sever not, trial will come unsought. Wouldst thou approve thy constancy? Approve first thy obedience. The other, who can know, not seeing thee attempted, who attest. But then he comes to the conclusion, because again, he is not going to lord it over her. He wants to acknowledge her freedom to choose. Says, but if thou think, trial unsought may find us both secure, then thus warned thou seemst, go. For thy stay, not free, absents thee more. In other words, you're no longer a human being if you do it under compulsion and not with free volition. Again, he's saying something, but he's acting like, again, Adam's like acting like God here. He's acknowledging, and he's not going to constrain her just because he says so or he thinks it's better, and she needs to be persuaded as well. Go in thy native innocence, rely on what thou hast of virtue, some and all, for God towards thee hath done his part, do thine. So spake the patriarch of mankind, but Eve persisted, yet submiss. Now this is interesting. She gets her own way, and yet she is still going to acknowledge, and again, this is Milton accounting for the unfallen nature of Eve. Though last replied, with thy permission then. He said from the beginning he didn't want her to go. I don't want you to go. It's a bad idea. You shouldn't do it. But I'm not going to insist on it because we would not be in paradise. You would not be free. You would not be as God declared you were if I insisted that you stay, and says, so if so, you can go. And she says, okay, with your permission. Now this is going to come back to bite him, because she's going to blame him when she falls for what she did as well, because you told me and you were there and God commanded you, right? And all this. Now, very well done. And there's an element of tragedy in this, of course, because we have two magnificent beings here, both honorable. The discussion between them is without blame. You can imagine such a discussion, but you can only imagine it because a human couple now, after the fall, would be much more heated and more motivated by sinful desires to win the argument and so forth. That's not really what's going on here. Very subtly done by Mr. Milton. But she goes with his permission, and then she says that it's unlikely that Satan will go after her because she is weaker than Adam, and that would do dishonor to him to go after the weaker of the two. She says she doesn't much expect a foe so proud the first will weaker seek. So bent the more shall shame him in his repulse. It's not going to come after me. So bent the more shall shame him in his repulse. Thus saying, from her husband's hand, her hand soft she withdrew. Remember the hand seizing. I talk about this repeatedly. The hands is a symbol. This comes up over and over again. The end of Paradise Lost, they leave Eden hand in hand. Here their hands part. When their hands are together, they're united. Remember the marriage ceremony? You've seen them. A couple's hands are joined by the priest. Sometimes they put something over top of it, a stole or something to unite them symbolically and so forth. But the idea of the two united in one is there in the hands, and they're separated here. There's no disunion. They're still united, but they're separated. And the separation is the means of division. And she goes on here, and Milton intercedes here in a way that is characteristic of epic poets. At something, and it's a way of increasing the tension in the text by saying this, O much deceived, much failing, hapless Eve, of thy presumed return, event perverse, thou never from that hour in paradise foundst either sweet repast or sound repose. Such ambush hid among sweet flowers and shades, waited with hellish rancor imminent to intercept thy way or send thee back despoiled of innocence, of faith, of bliss. For now, and since first break of dawn, the fiend, mere serpent in appearance, forth was come, and on his quest where likeliest he might find the only two of mankind, but in them the whole included race, his purposed prey. In bower and field he sought, but he seeks them both, but wishes to fall on Eve separate. And he doesn't hope that that's going to happen because they're very rarely separated, but lo, he finds her, veiled in a cloud of fragrance, where she stood half spied, so thick the roses bushing round about her globe. Now this is a wonderful passage, by the way. Pathetic fallacy. She's a flower, so thick their bushes rounding about her globe, oft stooping to support each flower of slender stalk, whose head, though gay carnation, purple, azure, or specked with gold, hung, drooping, unsustained, them she upstays gently with myrtle bound. Now you've seen flowers, the roses, they fall over because of the weight of the heads, and so what do? Then you prop them up with a stake, or here with a myrtle band, you tie them together to a stake. And that's what she's doing. But, mindless the while, herself, though fairest unsupported flower, from her best prop so far, and storm so nigh. Nearer he drew, and many a walk traversed of stateliest covert, etc. But note, she's a flower without her stalk. The man who would upstay her, who would keep her from being knocked down in the storm that's about to come. Again, it's a fantastic way of building the suspense of what is about to transpire. And we already know what's going to transpire because God's already predicted what will inevitably come from this. When I say inevitable, he foresees in his eternal perspective, outside space and time, he predicts the fall. And so it goes on, and he thinks for a while, and he looks upon her, Satan does, and one last, before we get to the temptation proper, he looks upon her, and he sees her, and for a second, her every air of gesture or last action overawed his malice, and with rapine, sweet, bereaved his fierceness of the fierce intent it brought. That space, the evil one, abstracted stood from his own evil, and for the time remained stupidly good. He doesn't transform to being good, but for a time, because of the sheer presence of the graceful person of Eve, he is defrauded. He's kept from his evil intention, even though he finds her on her own. For the first time, he cannot even believe it, but he hesitates. Of guile, of hate, of envy, of revenge, but the hot hell that always in him burns, though in mid-heaven, soon ended his delight, and tortures him now more, the more he sees of pleasure not for him ordained. Then soon fierce hate he recollects, and all his thoughts of mischief gratulating thus excites. Thoughts, whither have ye led me? With what sweet compulsion thus transported to forget what hither brought us? Hate, not love, nor hope of paradise for hell. Hope here to taste of pleasure, but all pleasure to destroy, save what is in destroying. Other joy to me is lost. Then let me not pass occasion which now smiles. Behold alone the woman, opportune to all attempts. Let's move on. And I intend her ruin, he says. And so spake the enmity of man, the enemy of mankind enclosed in serpent, inmate bad, and toward Eve addressed his way. And he does it not by sliding on the ground like a serpent now, but he puts him up on its coils, and he's upright like a man. If you've ever seen a cobra, how they rear themselves up, it's a bit like that. But he's up on his coils even. And so he appears again, and he's already meditated on what his means of tempting her will be. It's that he becomes like a man. A brute which lacked reason and the capacity to understand spiritual matters will act as if he were spiritually erect like a man. And thereby will be able to say to her, since you're born of earth, you will also be able to benefit likewise. And he floats in front of her, and she then sees him. And he's compared to all manner of predecessors, Circe and Cadmus and various other ancient serpents mentioned here. And she notices him and thinks it's very amusing. She notices the animals, this particular animal's up in front of her. And she says, wonder not, sovereign mistress, if perhaps thou canst, who art sole wonder, Much less arm thy looks, the heaven of mildness, with disdain, displeased that I approach thee thus, and gaze insatiate, I thus single, nor have feared thy awful brow, more awful thus retired. Fairest resemblance of thy Maker fair, thee all things living gaze on, all things thine by gift, and thy celestial beauty adore, with ravishment beheld, there best beheld where universally admired. But here, in this enclosure wild, these beasts among, beholders rude, and shallow to discern half what in thee is fair, one man except, who sees thee, and what is one? Who shouldst be seen a goddess among gods, adored and served by angels numberless, thy daily train. So glozed the tempter, and his proem tuned into the heart of Eve, his words made way, though at the voice much marveling, at length, not unamazed, she thus in answer spake. So note all the little details here. The details of him talking about him admiring her, the fact that she bears, everything he says here is true about her. And remember that she does have angels as her attendants, and is meant for better things. God himself has already spoken, at least through the angels, that the intention is that God, is that man, though born of earth, will become more and more godlike. That's God's own intention. Will unite heaven and earth, will bring man up, although created low, will through obedience and through willing obedience, will make him more and more of a spiritual being as time goes by. Satan plays on all of that here, but notes that how far she is from that, and how low her station is, and how inappropriate it is. Because there's only one man who truly sees her and appreciates her. The rest are a bunch of animals, beasts like him. And she is amazed at everything he says, and answers him in accordance with that. What may this mean? Language of man, expressed or pronounced by tongue of brute, and human sense expressed. The first at least of these I thought denied to beasts, whom God on their creation day created mute to all articulate sound. Articulate sound is a word, it points, by the way. The articulus is your index finger. You point at things with it. And an articulate sound, and the beasts make sounds as well, but an articulate sound is a word. It identifies something. It's this and not that. It's this particular thing, and it talks about all the properties of it. That's what articulate sound means. I didn't think they had those sounds. And the sounds were connected with reasoning. The first at least of I thought denied to beasts, whom God on their creation day created mute to all articulate sound. The latter I demur, for in their looks much reason, and in their actions oft appears. Thee, serpent, subtlest beast of all the field, I knew, but not with human voice endued. Redouble then this miracle, and say, how camest thou speakable of mute? And how to me so friendly grown above the rest of brutal kind, that daily are in sight? Say, for such wonders claims attentions due. And she commands this, and he then gives a little potted history of how he came to have speech, which is that he was wandering in the fields and he saw a wonderful tree, and just the smell of the fruit on the tree was so terrific that it woke an appetite in me. The most beautiful thing he ever saw. He ate of it, and then suddenly he found that he was transformed in the process and was able to speak. And suddenly not only to speak, but to be able to think in reasoning and to understand spiritual matters that were far beyond him. So it's a magical fruit. And he turned his speculations higher deep to thoughts which he had not hitherto thought. And to degree of reason in my inward powers and speech, wanted not long, though to this shape retained. Thenceforth to speculations high and wide, high or deep, I turned my thoughts, and with capacious mind considered all things visible in heaven, or earth, or middle, all things fair and good, but all that fair and good in thy divine semblance, and in thy beauty's heavenly ray united I beheld. No fair to thine equivalent or second, which compelled me thus though importune perhaps, to come and gaze and worship thee of right declared, sovereign of creatures, universal dame. So talked the sly, spirited snake, and Eve, yet more amazed, unwary, thus replied. All the things that Adam forewarned her about just before this. A specious, fair-appearing good will catch her unawares. Why is it unawares? Because, again, everything that she sees in front of her makes perfect sense. We have a serpent who is incapable of speaking, yet speaking, demonstrating the capacity of reasoning that she thought he had lacked, and yet clearly in his articulation of it making perfect sense to her. The only comment she makes is, serpent, thy overpraising leaves in doubt the virtue of that fruit. You're flattering me. In thee first prove, but say where grows the tree. So he takes her to the tree. Come after me. She comes to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and she says, serpent, we may have spared our coming hither. Fruitless to me, whose fruit be here to excess, the credit of whose virtue rest with thee, wondrous indeed if cause of such effects. But of this tree we may not taste or touch. God so commanded. Now what has he introduced here? The serpent has eaten of the fruit of the tree. No mention of that in the Genesis text. But we have a serpent who's speaking. Right? And serpents can't speak. Right? So in a sense, Milton is reading into the text that this is the means by which the dialogue ensues. Makes perfect sense. He's speculating, but it does make sense. So, you may eat of it, but we may not. Now, how can that be? Well, there's an injustice apparent in that. A beast that is below mankind may do something that is prohibited to man. Well, that says that they're not free and they're not godlike, and there's something diminished in them that is nonetheless accessible to a brute. There's the push right there. A lower being can do something that we can't do. We're less free. It's the same argument that was used against staying together. But she said, don't do it. Sole daughter of his voice, the rest we live law to ourselves. Our reason is our law. To whom the tempter guilefully replied, indeed, hath God then said that of the fruit of all these garden trees ye shall not eat? Yet lords declared of all in earth or air. There you go. Terrific argument. Called you lords, but you can't eat of that. And I ate of it. And I'm not the Lord. But he's called you this. But he's prohibited that. Pushes the antithesis between them. To whom thus Eve, yet sinless, of the fruit of each tree in the garden we may eat. But now he's leading her. Right? He is leading her down a path of argumentation that she's going to find herself in a position where her arguments fall short. Of the fruit of each tree in the garden we may eat, but of the fruit of this tree fair amidst the garden God hath said, ye shall not eat thereof, nor shall ye touch it, lest ye die. She scarce had said, though brief, when now more bold the tempter, but with show of zeal and love to man and indignation at his wrong. So he becomes a humanitarian. He thinks there's an injustice here. Just like Satan perceived there to be an injustice in heaven when God the Son was exalted and he not, and he felt himself impaired and thereby sinned and thought that he should take the place that God the Son did, he now puts the same thoughts in mankind. After all, a beast has attained speech. Man has been prohibited from the same thing, because God said, after all, if you eat of this, the knowledge of good and evil, you shall be as gods, knowing both of those things. Why would he want to prevent that? It suggests bad character on God's part. And that will be the argument then. Show of zeal and love to man, and indignation at his wrong. New part puts on, and is to passion moved, fluctuates disturbed, yet comely and in act raised as of some great matter to begin. As when of old, epic simile, as when of old some orator renowned in Athens or free Rome, where eloquence flourished, since mute, to some great cause addressed, stood in himself collected, while each part, motion, each act, one audience ere the tongue. Sometimes in height began, as no delay of preface brooking through his zeal of right, so standing, moving, or to height upgrown the tempter, all impassioned, thus began. O sacred, wise, and wisdom-giving plant, mother of science, now I feel thy power within me clear, not only to discern things in their causes, but to trace the ways of highest agents, deemed however wise. Queen of this universe, do not believe those rigid threats of death. Ye shall not die. How should ye? By the fruit, it gives you life to knowledge. By the threatener, look on me, me who have touched and tasted, yet both live, and life more perfect have attained than fate meant me, by venturing higher than my lot. Shall that be shut to man, which to the beast is open? Or will God incense his ire for such a petty trespass, and not praise rather your dauntless virtue, whom the pain of death denounced, whatever thing death be, deterred not from achieving what might lead to happier life, knowledge of good and evil. Of good, how just? Of evil, if what is evil be real, why not known, since easier shunned? God therefore cannot hurt ye, and be just. Not just, not God. Not feared then, nor obeyed. Your fear itself of death removes the fear. Why then was this forbid? Why but to awe? Why but to keep ye low and ignorant, his worshippers? He knows that in the day ye eat thereof, your eyes that seem so clear, yet are but dim, shall perfectly be then opened and cleared, and ye shall be as gods, knowing both good and evil as they know. That ye should be as gods, since I as man, internal man, is but proportion meet. I of brute, human, ye of human, gods. So ye shall die, perhaps, by putting off human to put on gods. Death to be wished, though threatened, which no worse than this can bring. And what are gods that man may not become as they participate in godlike food? The gods are first, and that advantage use on our belief, that all from them proceeds. I question it, for this fair earth I see, warmed by the sun, producing every kind, them nothing. If they all things who enclose knowledge of good and evil in this tree, that whoso eats thereof forthwith attains wisdom without their leave. How is this possible? And wherein lies the offense that man should thus attain to know? And what can your knowledge hurt him, or this tree impart against his will, if all be his? Or is it envy? And can envy dwell in heavenly breasts? These and many more causes import your need of this fair fruit. Goddess humane, reach then and freely taste. He ended, and his heart's replete with guile, full with guile, into her heart too easy entrance one. Fixed on the fruit, gazed, which to behold might tempt alone. And in her ears the sound yet rung of his persuasive words, impregned with reason in to her seeming, and with truth. Meanwhile the hour of noon draw on, and she's getting hungry as well. Her appetite's awakened, and her reason leads her to think it's a good thing to do. And eventually, and now she talks about this, and then she has a little internal monologue in which she considers the possibilities here and persuades herself of what Satan has just said is true. And note, this is important. She's not just credulous, she follows his reasoning. There, she will then in this speech, I'm going to skip over it because I'm going to run out of time. I have to pick it up at some of book 9 next time. But he sees exactly this. Here grows the cure of all, this fruit divine, fair to the eye, inviting to the taste, of virtue to make wise. What hinders then to reach and feed at once both body and mind? Famous lines. So saying, her rash hand in evil hour, forth reaching to the fruit, she plucked, she eat. Earth felt the wound, and nature from her seat, sighing, though all her works gave signs of woe, that all was lost. Back to the thicket slunk the guilty serpent, and well might, for Eve intent now wholly on her taste, naught else regarded, such delight till then as seemed in fruit she never tasted, whether true or fancied so, through expectations high of knowledge, nor was Godhead from her thought, greedily engorged without restraint, and knew not eating death. Satiate at length, and heightened as with wine, jocund and boon, thus to herself she pleasingly began. And what does she do? She worships the tree. So she goes from worshiping God to worshiping herself and then worshiping the tree. She becomes an idolater right away. And then considers what she should do. Let's say I've run out of time here, so I can't trace it all through, but I will pick it up next time. But note that Milton's terrific account here of the speech that would have taken place here. And by the way, the speech that she gives here is an absolute travesty of the hymns to the tree of life that were given earlier. This is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and it is a parody almost of that. Because the tree of life, again, they're not, if you know the account, they're not going to eat of that. God takes them away before they should eat of that and be lost eternally, because they will not die then. Death is actually a means of mercy to them. Because again, God the Son will die and bring about the undoing of all this, and the propitiation or atonement for sin were not possible if mankind had eaten of the tree of life after this. But her thought processes then go on, and where she leads, and Milton leads into terrific or horrific thoughts here when she considers for the first time, well, how about Adam? What will I do with him then? How will I appear to him? She considers what death might mean. I'll pick it up there next time. Say